Over the past 72 hours, something strange has unfolded between the United States and Iran. On the surface, it looks like a familiar pattern. Rising tensions, military threats, Al-Aswaq reacting sharply. But then, unexpectedly, a sudden shift, a delay, claims of productive talks, and almost immediately, a denial from the other side. So what is actually happening here? Is this the beginning of de-escalation? Or just another strategic move in a much larger geopolitical game? Because when you look closely, the timeline doesn't quite add up. One side claims negotiations are already producing results. The other insists no such talks ever took place. And in the middle of all this confusion, global markets reacted instantly. Oil prices, stocks, even government bonds, all moving as if something significant had changed. That raises a critical question. Are we witnessing real diplomacy, or a calculated attempt to influence perception, markets, and momentum? In this video, we're going to break it down step by step. What actually happened over the weekend? Why the narrative is so inconsistent? And most importantly, what this means for the risk of a wider conflict. Because despite the brief sense of relief, the underlying reality may be far more unstable than it appears. To understand what's going on, we need to reconstruct the timeline, but more importantly, interpret what each move really signals. Let's start at the beginning. Over the weekend, the situation escalated rapidly when the United States signaled a much tougher stance toward Iran, particularly around energy routes in the region. The message was clear. If certain conditions weren't met within a short time frame, there could be direct consequences targeting Iran's energy infrastructure. This wasn't just rhetoric. It immediately raised concerns about supply disruptions in one of the most critical energy corridors in the world. In response, Iran did not show signs of backing down. Instead, officials signaled that any action against their infrastructure would likely trigger a broader regional response. That includes potential pressure points beyond Iran itself, meaning the situation could expand rather than stay contained. Now, here's where things get interesting. As soon as markets opened, the reaction was immediate. Energy prices moved sharply upward. Asian stock markets saw noticeable declines. Investors began shifting expectations, anticipating prolonged instability. This kind of synchronized reaction tells us something important. Weren't reacting to confirmed events, they were reacting to risk. And that risk, at the time, looked like it was increasing fast. But then, just as momentum was building toward escalation, the narrative suddenly changed. Shortly before major US markets opened, the White House indicated a pause, a temporary delay in any potential escalation. At the same time, there were claims that behind-the-scenes discussions had been constructive and pointed toward a possible resolution. On paper, that sounds like de-escalation, but almost immediately, a completely different version of events emerged. Iranian officials publicly rejected the idea that any meaningful discussions had taken place at all. In fact, they suggested that the claims of progress were inaccurate, or at the very least, exaggerated. So now we have two conflicting narratives. One side signaling progress and restraint. The other denying any shift in position. And that contradiction is the key to understanding what might really be happening. Because in geopolitics, what is said publicly is often just as important as what is happening privately. At this point, the biggest question is not what happened. It's why the two sides are telling completely different stories. Because in international politics, contradictions like this are rarely accidental. They usually serve a purpose. 1. Managing market reactions. One of the most immediate explanations is market signaling. When tensions rise in a region tied closely to global energy supply, markets don't wait for confirmation, they react to. And when that risk involves key routes, even small changes in tone can trigger large price swings. So, when the US signaled a delay and mentioned productive conversations, the effect was almost instant. Pressure on energy prices eased. Investor sentiment stabilized. Short-term panic slowed down. From a strategic standpoint, this raises a possibility. The messaging may have been designed, at least in part, to cool markets without making concrete concessions. In other words, signaling calm, even if the underlying situation hasn't fundamentally changed. 2. Strategic ambiguity. The second factor is something often used in high-stakes diplomacy: strategic ambiguity. This is when a country deliberately keeps its position unclear in order to maintain flexibility, avoid locking itself into a specific outcome, keep the other side guessing. By suggesting that talks are happening without fully confirming details, one side can appear open to diplomacy, reduce immediate pressure, while still keeping military or economic options on the table. At the same time, the other side may reject that narrative publicly to avoid looking weak or ustupчивый domestically. So both sides benefit. One signals openness, the other signals strength, even if, behind the scenes, communication channels may or may not exist. 3. Domestic and political positioning. There's also an internal dimension that often gets overlooked. Leaders don't just communicate with each other, they communicate with domestic audiences, political allies, regional partners. Public statements are carefully calibrated. For example, suggesting progress can project control and stability. Denying negotiations can project resistance and independence. So, the contradiction we're seeing may not be a breakdown in communication. It may actually be two different messages aimed at two different audiences. So what does this tell us? When you combine these factors, a clearer picture starts to emerge. It's entirely possible that informal outreach has happened. No formal negotiations are underway. And both sides are shaping the narrative for strategic reasons. Which means the apparent de-escalation might be more about perception than reality. And that brings us to the most important question. If this isn't a clear move toward peace, then what happens next? So if the situation isn't clearly stabilizing, what are the realistic paths forward? Instead of guessing a single outcome, it's more useful to think in terms of scenarios, each with different signals to watch. Scenario 1. Controlled de-escalation. This is the outcome markets are currently hoping for. In this scenario, communication channels, even informal ones, remain open. Both sides avoid direct escalation. Rhetoric stays strong, but actions remain limited. You might see more delays instead of decisive moves. Carefully worded statements hinting at progress. Parties quietly facilitating contact behind the scenes. If this plays out, tensions don't disappear, but they become managed rather than explosive. A signal. No major new actions, only controlled messaging shifts. Scenario 2. Prolonged standoff. This is often the most common outcome in situations like this. Here, neither side backs down, but neither side escalates dramatically either. Instead, you get ongoing pressure, economic and political friction, repeated cycles of threat, pause, denial. This creates a kind of new normal where uncertainty becomes constant. Markets may stabilize, but remain sensitive to headlines. Key signal, repetition. Same pattern, different headlines. Scenario 3. Sudden escalation. This is the risk that hasn't gone away. Even if both sides prefer to avoid escalation, the structure of the situation makes it fragile. Miscommunication. Overreaction to limited actions. Pressure from regional actors. All of these can push things in a more serious direction quickly. And importantly, escalation doesn't always start with a major decision. Sometimes it begins with a small move that triggers a chain reaction. Key signal. Unexpected actions that break the current pattern. The critical constraint. Across all three scenarios, there's one underlying issue. The gap between what each side wants is still very wide. Even if we assume that public demands are exaggerated for negotiation purposes, the distance between positions remains significant. That makes a quick, clean resolution unlikely. Right now, the situation is not defined by clarity. It's defined by uncertainty being actively managed. Messaging is being used as a tool. Markets are reacting to perception as much as reality. And the actual direction depends on decisions that may not be visible yet. So while short-term calm is possible, the structural risks are still very much in place. So when you step back and look at the bigger picture, one thing becomes clear. This isn't just a geopolitical situation. It's a battle of narratives, timing, and leverage. On the surface, you see statements about talks, signals of restraint, short-term market relief. But underneath that, the fundamentals haven't really changed. Strategic objectives are still far apart. Trust remains extremely limited, and multiple actors are influencing the outcome, not just two. Which means, what looks like progress today could easily reverse tomorrow. The key insight most people miss. A lot of coverage focuses on what was said, but in situations like this, what matters more, why it was said and when. A delay might not mean compromise. A statement about progress might not mean negotiation. A denial might not mean zero contact. These are all tools used to shape expectations, reduce pressure, or buy time. So how should you read this situation? Instead of asking, are they negotiating or not? A better question is, who benefits from the current narrative and why? Because once you start looking at it that way, the contradictions start to make a lot more sense. Final thought. For now, the situation remains highly fluid. Short-term calm is possible. Long-term resolution is still uncertain. And until the underlying gaps are addressed, any sense of stability should be viewed as temporary, not permanent. If you found this breakdown useful and want more clear, no-noise analysis of global events, make sure to subscribe and follow for upcoming videos. Because in a world where information moves fast, understanding how to interpret it is becoming just as important as the news itself.